In 1942, a secret city in America, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was born as a direct result of a letter written by Albert Einstein to President Roosevelt, citing the urgent need to develop the capability to sustain a chain reaction of uranium. From Einstein's letter came the plan for our nation to create an atomic weapon that would be more powerful than any weapon in the history of the world. The Manhattan Project, created to develop this amazing new atomic weapon, spent 60 cents of every dollar in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. For 7 years, this secret city was not shown on any maps, did not allow any visitors other than by special approval, had guards posted at the entrances to the city, and required all residents to wear badges at all times when outside their homes. Several different work sites were built in Oak Ridge, Tennessee in order to accommodate the U.S. government's need to develop uranium for the war effort. Plants labeled X10, K25, and Y12 were all constructed. Workers at these plants were segregated by job duty and not permitted to discuss what they were doing in their work. Almost 60 years later, Congress recognized that thousands of workers employed in these atomic hazardous material plants were exposed to deadly radioactive and toxic substances, and they passed in July 2001 the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program Act to provide compensation to persons who became ill as a result of work at these facilities. Today, the Insider Exclusive presents a behind-the-scenes look at why, despite this congressional legislation intended to help sick government workers, instead has created roadblocks and obstacles by forcing the majority of workers who file claims to litigate with the Department of Energy's lawyers. The result? It has deterred employees from filing workers' compensation claims and has imposed major financial burdens for such employees who have sought this compensation. In fact, contractors of the department have been held harmless and their employees have been denied workers' compensation coverage for occupational diseases. Over the past 20 years, more than 24 scientific findings have emerged that indicate that certain employees are experiencing increased risk of dying from cancer and non-malignant diseases. The Insider Exclusive will speak with Bruce Fox, co-founder of the Energy Workers Legal Research Center in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and partner at Fox and Farley Law Firm, who for the past 31 years has represented all types of workers who work in dangerous and hazardous conditions in America, obtaining full and fair compensation for their clients. He will tell you why the system has failed and how to fix it. Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive live from Clinton, Tennessee at the law firm of Fox and Farley. It is my great privilege to introduce Bruce Fox of the law firm of Fox and Farley. Welcome to the show, Bruce.
Steve, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Today's show is a very interesting show because I know you do a lot of work on behalf of folks that work at the Y12, is it the
X10,
and
K25.
Oak Ridge Labs, National Laboratories.
Correct.
And a lot of these workers have been exposed to hazardous material over the years and have suffered a number of illnesses that are chronic, that are sometimes fatal. And let's talk about what your firm does for these workers.
Steve, we're helping these workers seek fair compensation and some semblance of justice for their years as energy workers who were part of the Cold War effort, part of the World War II effort. A bit of history. The city of Oak Ridge was called the Secret City. It was non-existent until 1942. It came about from Albert Einstein writing to President Roosevelt saying we need to find a way to split the atom and create a weapon to end these wars. Roosevelt went to the Senate and the Congress and brought in Tennessee's Democratic Senator McKellar, who was head of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and asked him if he could quietly appropriate enough funds for the Manhattan Project for the war effort to develop this atomic weapon. The story is that Senator McKellar replied to Roosevelt, "Yes, Mr. President, we can get the funding. where in Tennessee are we going to build this facility? And it landed here in Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
And this is the largest manufacturing area and processing area of uranium in the country.
It is. It's also the home of the Spoliation Neutron Project, the world's largest scientific project, the world's fastest computer. It's a storage facility for the nation's stockpile of enriched uranium. It's also a place where those weapons are both disassembled and reassembled.
As you are well aware, the illnesses that affected people because of working with all of this radioactive material, this hazardous material. Why did it take so long, 60 years almost, for Congress to pass legislation helping the workers?
Well, that's a very good question, Steve, and I wish I had a valid answer. Until Congress addressed this in the turn of the century, in the year 2000, these cases we could not bring or be successful with.
What would the government do?
They fought us on every front, including discovery. We could
Right.
not find out where the worker worked. The
Right.
worker was not permitted to tell me as his attorney what areas he worked in, what materials he worked around.
And you handled cases like this?
I started handling some around 2000, before the federal program.
Yeah.
I'll give you the first case I was successful with. Was a man named William J. Harris. He was an African American. His job at the K-25 plant was to wear duck hunting waders every day to work and work in the sludge pond, where all this hazardous waste had been dumped in these holding ponds. And they were cleaning it up. And they had track hose in there, and they would pick the sludge up and put it in 55-barrel drums. And Mr. Harris's job was to take a hammer and put the top on the drum and hammer it into place. So he was exposed to this sludge all day, every day, and he developed at a young age, in his early 40s, a brain tumor.
And the sludge was radioactive material.
And contaminated with PCBs, with benzene, with multiple chemicals, too many to name.
What years was he doing this?
He probably worked there about 15 years before he developed this cancer.
So this was in the 80s?
In the 80s. He came to me before he died and asked me to take his case. And I was hesitant because I knew the proof would be difficult. I knew getting the government contractors to pay would be difficult, but I felt for this man and I took his case. And I went over and visited his oncologist at the University of Tennessee Teaching Hospital. The head of hematology oncology was Dr. Wahid Hanna. I asked him about his opinions on causation, and he said, well, tell me what he worked around. I said, well, I really can't. It's secret. He said, well, I can tell you this. A man of his age, African American, should never have developed a brain tumor of this type,
Right.
absent some exposure to some hazardous chemical or radiation or both. With that, I went ahead and took the case, and we did discovery and took Mr. Harris's testimony before he died by video, so the judge would have it.
Right.
After he passed, things were moving toward trial. I needed to take Dr. Hanna's deposition, and I needed badly to know what the materials were in that sludge pond. And other people knew I had this case, other employees out there, and I got a manila envelope in the mail addressed to me, no return address.
Yeah.
And it was the site matrix for that sludge pond to tell me what chemicals were in there. And I took it,
What was in that envelope again?
a site matrix. It told us what chemicals and what hazardous
And it was
materials.
like a scientific report.
It was an internal report.
Really?
I took it to Dr. Hanna, and he gave his testimony that those materials had caused Mr. Harris's testimony. And just before trial, about a week before the trial, the lawyers representing the government in the case called me and said, we'll pay this case, we'd like to settle it. They did not want a public disclosure.
So my question is, did they put any kind of restrictions on your access to this material?
Well, they wondered where I got it, and I just had to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
It came to my office, and I to this day have no idea who it came from.
Were you able to use this same document in other cases?
Actually, I didn't need to. As this program evolved,
Yeah.
one thing that did happen is they've opened the vault, so to speak, and allowed us access to the sites.
And
the government, when we file the claim for the worker, will do a site assessment for that employee, every building they've worked in, every site for their entire career, and then issue a report about what their exposures were.
And when you were talking about in the year 2000, that's the Department of Energy. When
That's
you're saying
correct.
the government.
That's correct, the Department of Energy.
And that is the legislation is the EEOICPA, correct?
That's correct. An acronym for Energy Employees Occupational Injury Compensation Act.
And the mission of the program is designed to do what?
To fairly compensate this group of employees who have been called Cold War patriots or heroes. They gave to the war effort, many times in secret, couldn't even tell their doctor or their spouse what they did, where they worked, or what they were exposed to when these illnesses arose. They could not disclose the area of their employment, what facility they worked in, what materials they worked with.
So they were afraid to come forward if they had a problem.
They were forbidden to come forward with it.
That's a shame. Today, fortunately, we have some of these clients here who are going to tell their personal experiences. One of them is a client of yours, Danny Walker.
Correct.
But first, we're going to bring on an associated lawyer that works on these cases, Tony Farmer, and he has a client that we're going to interview too. So let's do that right now. Today, we're real privileged to have with us Tony Farmer, who's a lawyer, and Gary Foster, his client. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Thank you.
And
Thank
welcome
you
to
very
the show, Gary.
Thank you.
Now, chronic beryllium disease is a disease that a lot of workers at the Y12 plant get. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Why is that? Why do they get this disease?
Go ahead.
From exposure to beryllium, the whole DOE complex used a lot of beryllium ever since the 1940s.
And beryllium is used in the process of what?
In a lot of different processes, but also in the process of parts of nuclear weapons.
Right. 1942 was when the Y12 plant was first built.
And I believe 1943.
1943. Okay. 2001, 59 years later, the government recognized that some workers, a lot of workers, had CBD, chronic beryllium disease, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. While you were working there, and you worked from what years?
At Y12 from 1979 until 2007. I worked 3 years prior to that at the K-25 facility.
During that time, the majority of that time, did the organization caution workers about exposure to beryllium?
No.
So you knew nothing about...
No, everything. They told us everything we worked with was safe.
They did?
Yes.
Those were the exact words?
Yeah, well, and they would say you can eat it and it won't hurt you.
Okay, and you now have chronic beryllium disease.
Yes, sir.
CBD, otherwise known as CBD. And CBD, how does that affect your life?
It's known primarily as a lung disease, but it can be systemic. In other words, it affects other organs of your body too. My biggest problem with it is it affects my joints more than anything. It also affects your lungs, in other words, your breathing capacity. Where beryllium does its damage is at the side of the lungs where the gas exchange takes place, where oxygen goes into the blood and carbon dioxide comes out of the blood.
Right.
And therefore it blocks that off just to simplify the
It blocks the
disease
process. So your body doesn't emit, or it's more difficult to emit carbon dioxide.
It's more difficult to get oxygen into your blood, and it's more difficult to get carbon dioxide out of your blood.
So it's kind of like a slow poisoning, isn't it?
I figure that I'm going to smother to death eventually.
Now, when you retired,
Yes.
you decided to go to work for Tony.
He sort of twisted my arm, and I came over there to help him with the U.S. Department of Labor claim.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. That was specifically for that, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
Because, Tony, let me ask you this question. There's a lot of workers that are affected with CBD, correct? Is it easy to get some sort of workman's disability or something like that?
Workers' compensation benefits are very difficult to develop for chronic beryllium disease, and because the company for decades refused to admit that beryllium was a toxic substance and could cause any type of injury.
Yeah.
Since the passage of the EEOICPA in 2001 that you referred to, the company has been forced by the United States Department of Labor to admit there's a relationship between workplace exposure and CBD. So the Congress, taking the dramatic step that they took in 2001, has simplified the process and prevented the contractors from denying their responsibility.
There are other diseases that workers contract by working at Y-12, aren't there?
Absolutely.
What other type of diseases are there?
There's a number of specific cancers that are covered by the legislation in 2001. Asbestosis is covered. They're all very serious medical conditions that are closely related in the medical literature to exposure to substances, including radiation,
Right.
that are on site.
And you handle a lot of these, don't you?
We
That's your
handle-
primary practice?
That is a very large part of our practice. We only represent injured people, but a very large part of that
Yeah.
is the representation of workers throughout all of the facilities in Oak Ridge.
And it must make you feel good, Gary, that you work with people that have similar situation where you can talk to them, on a personal level. It must make you feel good emotionally, and that they're in good hands with Tony to try and recover money for this disability, right?
Exactly. That's the reason that I agreed to come to work over there, is to help these people. They can communicate with me because I've been there. In other
Yeah.
words, somebody from Y-12 says I worked in this building or this
Yeah.
building. I've been there.
Do workers find it difficult initially to get compensation for these
The
disease-related?
process that Gary works in so well, that is the Department of Labor process in claiming benefits, is almost unmanageable by most workers. The government makes it so difficult, despite Congress's establishing a policy of compensating these folks. The Department of Labor complicates the process so much that it becomes overwhelming for the majority of the workers.
So in other words, Congress passed a law to help everybody, and the government now is doing everything it can to kind of inhibit or prevent you to recover what you need to recover.
It's what government does. They move the goalposts on you, and
Yeah.
you have to keep in touch with how they've moved the goalpost and what they require of you to get a successful claim.
So if there is a worker out there who needs assistance, they can definitely contact you.
Absolutely.
All right, both of you. And thank you very much for being on the
Thank you.
program. Thanks for spending the time. We're going to
Thank
get the
you.
word out.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, Tony.
All right.
We have another client on the show that is represented by Bruce Fox, and his name is Danny Walker. Welcome to the show again, Bruce.
Good to be here, Steve.
Welcome to the show,
Good to be
Danny.
here, sir.
I understand that you suffer from renal cancer
Yes, sir.
and other diseases that as a result of working at the Y-12 plant, correct?
Correct, sir.
Can you tell our audience a little bit about that?
Well, I've had 34 years at Y-12, and all that time I was in a radioactive area of the plant. And my craft was a machinist. Started out there as a machinist, a machine operator
Yeah.
in 1968. And I worked my way up through the ranks. And I was an operation manager and a general foreman when I retired. So I was there in the large, when we had large operations going, so the production was at the highest.
And what were you were a machinist, but what were you actually doing?
We were turning and drilling the uranium,
Okay.
making parts out of it,
And that was used in what?
and the weapons.
Okay. And were there any like warning signs anywhere or?
Well, generally, when the process, I was in machining at the time I was out there. You know, you had warnings that training about evacuations if they had a
Yeah.
high criticality.
But not medical warnings.
No, you had no air samples. You had no smears that were taken.
Right.
With different times we'd call them, we'd worry, say, well, you know, this stuff is, when the first RN, you were just a kid on the block, and they tell you, well, you can eat this stuff and it won't hurt you.
Yeah. Bruce, you represent him, and there are a lot of workers who have suffered similar results.
Literally thousands,
Thousands.
if not tens of thousands of workers who've suffered from either 22 cancers known to be caused by radiation or other diseases like beryllium lung disease, silica lung disease, asbestos lung disease. Primarily, the radiation caused cancers.
Yeah, now we have Congress set up in 2001 a legislation to try and compensate people who have developed serious illnesses as a result of working with hazardous materials. Do you find it easy for them to seek some sort of medical assistance or compensation with this new legislation?
It's a 2 to 3 year process just to go through the evaluation.
Yeah.
We find about 50% of the applicants, like Danny,
Yeah.
get turned down on the first application. And that's what brings lawyers into the system to help them gather the information they need to be able to prove causation, that their cancer was caused
Yeah.
by either radiation exposure or by chemical exposure.
Danny, you worked for the company for 34 years.
Yes, sir.
They were good to you?
Yes, sir, they were good to me.
What's your feeling about them today?
Well, the companies, they were good to me, but I was good at the company too. You know, I came up through the ranks, and I went in supervision. I went up through the ranks of supervision, and I put a lot of hours in. So now I think it's time for the company to come back and repay me, because I didn't ask for this cancer.
Thank you very much for coming on the show
Yes,
and
sir.
sharing, your
It's a pleasure.
situation. And thank Bruce for doing a great job for you, doing a
He's
great
a good-
job for a
good
lot of
man.
workers. We are fortunate to have Chris Hayes with Bruce here, who is going to be talking about the Energy Workers Legal Resource Center. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you.
Bruce, you and Chris founded this program?
Well, Tony Farmer and I approached Chris about opening a law office that
Yes.
would service the energy workers exclusively. Chris at that time was the in-house counsel at Y12, and he was defending cases we were filing for energy workers. And he agreed to come over to the righteous side and work with us in representing the energy workers who were exposed to hazardous materials at Oak Ridge. And we founded at that time the Energy Workers Legal Resource Center, and Chris is the staff lawyer who manages, operates,
Right.
and runs that entire program.
There are some questions that any worker might have, and I'm going to ask some of them to you. Like, for example, what is workers' compensation and when does it apply in Tennessee? Either one of you.
Well, it's a program, it's a compromise program
Yeah.
to compensate any employee who's injured on the job without respect to who was at fault or whether there was negligence.
Right.
You don't have to prove that. If you're injured on the job in the scope and course of your employment, then there should be fair compensation paid according to a schedule established by our legislature in Tennessee.
In one of the clients that we had on the show, I think it was Danny Walker, correct?
Correct.
Who has developed renal cancer a year after he left 34 years of employment at Y12. And it seems that the government can't connect the dots there or don't want to connect the dots. My question to you is, you have cases of gradual injuries as a result of working and being exposed to hazardous material. How do you approach those cases?
Well, certainly there's a scale.
Yeah.
A
scale.
From white to black with gray in the middle.
Yeah.
Some cases connecting those dots are easier than others.
Yeah.
The ones that people have probably heard about if the diagnosis is asbestosis, most doctors agree it comes from asbestos exposure.
Yeah.
You get into some of the cancers, for example, like Mr. Walker's cancer.
Yeah.
That basically is a function of working with their doctors and doing your homework to know what the person worked with to try to get the dots connected.
Yeah. When we talk about recovery, when we talk about some of the benefits or compensation, how do they determine in dollars and cents someone who's been diagnosed with CBD, for example, or cancers? How do they come up with a number to, I guess, compensate? Is that the right word?
It's the right word, and it's a mathematical formula based upon what's called a medical impairment rating.
Okay.
The physician, generally the treating physician, but many times it's just an evaluating physician because the treating physician may no longer be around.
Right.
We have them see the client, evaluate that medical condition, and use a book called the American Medical Guides to the Evaluation of Impairment. And they come up with a numeric rating that sort of measures the severity of how this cancer or this lung disease has impacted this employee.
How many workers come to your center on a regular basis?
50 sometimes 100 a month.
That many. And you had mentioned, Bruce, that probably 50% of them get turned down.
I would say that's about right, 50%.
Okay. Why do they get turned down? Are they not legitimate claims or what?
My personal feeling is that many of those claims are turned down because medical science just hasn't caught up with what common sense would
Really?
tell us.
Connecting the dots again.
Connecting the dots again.
So the big problem here is connecting those dots, isn't it?
And-
That's what you're haggling with at all times.
And the fact that medical science is inexact.
Right.
A doctor many times with a renal cancer, if put to task, can't tell any individual in any particular circumstance why that person has the renal cancer.
Your Energy Workers Legal Resource Center has a website, does it not?
Correct.
What is that?
EnergyWorkersLegal.com.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming here and sharing that
you.
information.
Appreciate it.
And, getting the word out that energy workers do have a place to go. Bruce, I got to tell you, I've never met a lawyer that had another organization that just was dedicated to these kinds of workers, and that organization is doing a tremendous amount of work. But your practice involves other type of cases, right?
Yes.
What type of cases besides these, hazardous material worker compensation programs and personal injury? What do you do?
Primarily auto-related trucking accidents, auto accidents, motorcycle accidents, some products liability work.
Yeah.
We've been involved in several national class actions, both as lead counsel and as associate counsel. We have 3 or 4 going on right now that we're involved in.
At this stage of your career, you take on cases that you want to take on. And what are those kinds of cases usually? I mean, what turns you on about a case?
Well, the client generally. Catastrophic injury cases, I try to work on those cases as opposed to letting the associates do those. I find cases that pique my interest.
Yeah.
I like to do the trucking litigation. It's always, when there's a big truck wreck, there's always a lot of damage going around, but there's also a lot of background of, logbooks and rules violations, and it gets to be pretty complex. And good lawyering on both sides,
Right.
and that's a challenge.
It's been a pleasure having you on the program today. You guys are doing great work, and this show has been something that I think a lot of energy workers will want to watch again and again, simply because, you've got answers for their problems. And thank you very much for being on the
Steve,
program.
thank you for helping us get the word out about these fine folks.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guests and our shows at www.insiderexclusive.com.